Baroness Mary Warnock graduated from Oxford University almost 60 years ago. Since then, she's held a number of distinguished posts, both in universities and in schools. She's chaired committees of national importance, like human fertilisation and environmental protection. She's best known, though, for the Warnock report, which looked at the needs. Baroness Warnock, thank you for joining us today. I mean, clearly, by any measure, your own education seems to have been very successful. Oxford quite early, and as a woman, that wasn't the normal thing to do in those years, and then into academia. So just tell us, what was your own schooling like? How do you look at it now?
Fantastic. I look at it as a kind of, well, a fantasy, because I was allowed to drop every subject except Latin and Greek and music. But looking back, I think my education was pretty freakish because it was so specialised. And
you, after graduating from Oxford, one of the things I find interesting about your career is you spent time as a don, then as a head teacher, whereas the pattern normally is, you know, be in one and stay there or go into the others, and you've dipped in and dipped out. Was that deliberate to sort of keep you in touch with teaching in different environments, or was it just the accident of a career?
I think it was just accident. I've always been a great one for saying yes if somebody asked me to do something. And after I'd been teaching philosophy at St Hugh's College, Oxford, for 15 years, I began to think, well, really, you know, I'd like a change. And somebody asked me whether I'd stand as headmistress of the Oxford High School. And I had been involved in schools all the time I'd been teaching, because in Oxford, the county then had always had someone from the university on their local education authority, and I'd been on that for a number of years. So I was deeply interested in schools.
Did you enjoy teaching in schools?
Oh, enormously.
It's very different than universities, though.
It's so much nicer. I absolutely loved it. It's a bit of my career I'd go back to.
But what is it that's better about schools than universities?
Well, partly, I think people at school, if they're well taught, are quite keen to talk to. I mean, they're not always trying to get away. They're not centrifugal at all. And so I had wonderful conversations with the people I taught, right from when they were 7 or 8 until they were 18.
You might have thought you'd have sort of stayed in academia, pushing the barriers of knowledge at Oxford or at some of the leading schools. And yet you spent a chunk of time doing the Warnock report into children with special educational needs. Where did that interest come from? Do you know why you were invited to chair that committee? And what made you say yes? Had you already got an interest in that part of education?
I really hadn't got much of an interest, except I'd come across some of the problems. In the 60s too, Oxford was very experimenting very much in primary education and going in for child-centred learning and all kinds of things, which horrified me a bit, I have to say. But I was becoming interested in that. And the person who asked me was Mrs. Thatcher, in fact. Right. She was then Education Secretary. But then the Conservative government fell almost immediately after, in 74. And the Labour Party took it on.
And the report was published in 78. So you must have been sitting as a committee for quite some time.
It was 4 years. We were given 4 years to do it. And the first part was easy. We were just collecting facts.
Yeah. But that's what's interesting, because I think that people now forget what education was like for children with learning difficulties prior to the Warnock report. I mean, when you began to collect those facts, what did you find? How was our education system dealing with these children with learning needs?
Well, there was one very important Education Act in 1972, and it was because of that, I think, that the committee was set up. And that brought all children, whatever their disabilities, under the Department of Education, as it then was. Up to 72, there had been some children who were so severely disabled that they were deemed to be ineducable, and they fell under the Department of Health or something. But that Education Act seemed to me to be absolutely groundbreaking. And I think schools and educational authorities found themselves at great loss. They didn't know how to deal with these extremely severely disabled children in an educational setting. So I think part of our task then was to explain a concept of education that would encompass all children even if they couldn't sit up, couldn't speak, couldn't feed themselves, still education meant an enormous amount to them. It meant a huge difference.
And it was a huge cultural change, and really, I suppose, raising expectations of them and making the education system realise
Nobody
that.
was allowed simply to vegetate with
That's right.
nothing being done. Children, as far as possible, who had special educational needs, were to be educated with other children. They were no longer a race apart. And we did try very hard to get away from the sort of medical model in which one was concentrating on what was wrong with the child, and thinking in terms of how far they could get along the sort of common educational road. I always had a vision in my mind of that Startrite advertisement with two children trudging along a road that disappears far into the future. And this is how I thought of education. So it was a road that was common to everybody.
How did you imagine it would turn out when you talked about educated children, presumably in schools together?
Well, we certainly never envisaged that the special schools should be abolished. And there was a particular category of children who were then known as maladjusted and are now emotionally and behaviourally challenged, or whatever they are, for whom we thought there would have always to be special schools, because our whole difficulty was not fitting in to the ordinary school environment. But then we also thought that probably special schools would remain for children who had very severe and complicated and multiple disabilities, including mental disabilities, but probably others as well.
Presumably what you were trying to say was that there needs to be more inclusion than there is, but it shouldn't be 100%.
Absolutely, that was exactly what we were trying to say. But there was, even on our committee, a fairly radical left, if I can put it like that, who thought that now that the comprehensive ideal had been introduced, that ideal would never be fulfilled unless all children went to the same school, whatever their disabilities.
And that argument is still mirrored today, isn't it, in the debate that we're having about SEN?
And I don't think that argument has changed, but it was never convincing, I think. And if in the report we did put in a lot of cautionary words about not carrying inclusion too far. And we also envisaged various different patterns of integration.
Yes.
But I think the good thing about that was, and still is, people could talk openly about their children's particularly mental disabilities, and it became accepted that you didn't hide away your children, or it wasn't a disgrace that they had a mental disability. And I think that did change, partly, as I said, because of the Act of Parliament of 1972, but partly because of our report.
And the other issue, you said in recent months that you've had second thoughts on, was that what we call the statement in process, that there should be some children with statements and others not. I mean, I think I've read that you said it's turned into a bit of a bureaucratic nightmare, and I would agree with you wholeheartedly. But if you talk to parents, they see that as the gold standard. It's the only thing that guarantees them the resources they feel their child needs.
Well, that, of course...
presumably that's why you went for statements, because it would carry a resource with it.
Yes, we wanted statements because it placed a mandatory duty on local authorities to provide what was in the statement. But that was an incredibly naive idea and took no account of shortage of resources.
Yes.
And of course, when in 1978, the real Thatcher cuts hadn't started really. They started in 1981, which was the year of the Education Act that followed our report. But we really hadn't grasped how important it was going to be that local authorities would be strapped for money.
It almost becomes a battle to get a statement to get the resource.
Yes, but the trouble is that the statement is pretty well valueless now because of shortage of money.
How do you think it could be coped with? Because there's no doubt that educated children with special needs is obviously more expensive, and there'll always be this dilemma of how much money have we got and how do we spend it. If you was to take the statements away and not have that, if you like, that legal protection, I mean, what judgment have you made about whether those children with great needs would be better served?
It is a real problem, but I think, rather reluctantly, I think, that treatment of children with special needs ought to be centralised in the sense that there ought to be ring-fenced
Yes.
money that simply may not be spent on anything else.
What you're suggesting almost is like a ring fencing to special needs rather than a ring fencing to each child that comes to the state.
Ring fencing for special needs, and then it could be left to the local authority or the schools to utilise all the possible ways there are of educating children with special needs, including schools grouping together,
Yes.
making use of special schools
Yes.
and their expertise and so on. And an imaginative authority could do far better if they had that money that had to be spent on that and nothing else.
You talk about patterns of provision. I think that's probably one of the most interesting parts of the present SEN debate. And you've talked about centres of excellence. And I'm not sure whether you imagine special schools being centres of excellence or whether we have units attached to mainstream schools as centres of excellence.
I think centres of excellence is an extremely useful idea. There's very little evidence about which kind of pattern works best, but there is some evidence that the Eleanor Rathbone Foundation has just produced that at any rate for children with moderate learning difficulties, units within the school work least well because they tend to get sidelined by the ambitions and plans of the main school. So my own feeling is that we ought to build up special schools which would then sort of radiate out. I know this is an idea that the Labour government has certainly had. They could radiate out their expertise. But I don't think one should regard them as good only for that. Because one of the things I've come to the conclusion is that a lot of children with special needs find it very difficult to learn anything in a large school. It's simply the press of other children, and this is particularly true of children with Asperger's or somewhere on the autistic.
So it's not just being in a small class, it's being in a small class in a small school.
Absolutely right. A small class, of course, is something, but for those children, they pretty well have to have one-to-one teaching anyway, whether in a classroom or not. But it's more, particularly this is true of secondary schools, it's more rushing from one classroom to another.
The corridors.
The absolute chaos that there is in any large school,
Yes.
in the playground and the corridors and everywhere. And children with Asperger's simply cannot cope with that. They simply go to ground and they begin to refuse to go to school at all, or they get sick. And so I think one of the huge merits of special schools is that they can be small in size. And of course then the staff ratio is extremely favourable. And best of all, everybody in the school knows everybody else. So it's like a family, really.
And security.
And so I think that anything that somehow set about abolishing that kind of learning environment for children would be a disaster for those children.
It's interesting, it goes back to the problem you had with your report to some extent, because I think it's still, my feeling is it's still a fairly small group that would want to, it's still there, would want to abolish all special schools. So perhaps it's the bit of the education system that needs to be more flexible than any other.
I think it should be flexible, and I think the wishes of parents are very, very important because they know whether their child is flourishing much better than the school itself.
Can I just take you back, because you mentioned something a while ago which I think is very much part of this debate. I wonder if it's a bigger part of the debate now than it was during the times of your report, and that's behaviour. I sometimes get very confused about the debate now with education behavioural difficulties just because the spread of behaviour that can include. I mean, I don't think anybody would defend absolutely disruptive children being in mainstream schools and spoiling life for everyone else. But that spectrum goes from, I suppose, badly behaved children to children with mental health problems.
Yes.
Is that a bigger issue now in the debate about SEN than it was during the time of your report?
I think the problem is greater now because I think there's less parental control over children, at least in some parts of the country and some sorts of housing estates and so on, so that the children come to school much less prepared than they used to listen to what an adult says. And many of the children, and some of them I've seen who come into the nursery or reception class at really awful sinker states, have never talked to an adult or been talked to by an adult at all. And so they don't know how to respond.
There is that connection now. There's something that's interested me a lot when I first went into the Department for Education, that this sort of correlation between SEN and free school meals and poverty. And if you go into some of the schools which you're describing at the moment and ask the head how many children they've got on the SEN register, they say up to 50%.
One of the things that now, looking back, was most grotesque about our committee was that we were specifically told by the department that we must not count social deprivation
As a special
educational need, nor even say that it was the cause of special educational need.
Right.
Well, now that looks to be absolutely ridiculous. And of course, these children may have incipient mental health problems, but if the school can pick up their problems right from nursery on, then they will gradually lose their special educational need. They'll be just like everybody else.
And that's important, because in this debate about SEN, it goes back to the statement that there's not often this feeling that you can have SEN and be identified as having SEN at 5, but by 11 it can be overcome and you can survive. Whereas if we've got a breadth of definition of SEN that includes those barriers that are caused by poverty, a good education system should be able to move children on, shouldn't it?
Of course. And my own rather simple-minded view is that if you take children who've got a really deprived background, have never been talked to by a grown-up, have very often been abused by grown-ups, singing and dancing and doing things together is one of the ways that they begin to learn to communicate.
But as ever with SEN, it depends on how well you've trained the teachers to be able to do that.
Yes.
The nature of the training we need to give teachers now is immense. How do we cope with that?
Absolutely. I mean, it seems to be quite preposterous that we have, I mean, this is speaking broadly, we have an education system that encourages inclusion of children with quite severe difficulties. And yet somehow teacher training seems to be stuck in a kind of 1940s model where you have to learn how to teach your special subject. And I think that if there's anything that needs a huge revolution, it's the training of teachers, at least in a lot of establishments, which somehow seem to be in a little island by themselves without any connection with what's going on in schools.
And yet many teachers, well, almost all teachers will have some children with special needs in their classes sometimes during the school year.
That's right.
I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but I think that SEN over the last few years has come centre stage again. I mean, your report was the Bible throughout my teaching career, and and time for a decade or more after that. I mean, do you feel that as a nation and as an education system we've got a clear direction, or in effect, do we need another Warnock report? Do we need somebody to collect the data, do the analysis, look at the evidence, look at the progress, and point a way forward?
I feel very strongly that the time has come to do that. And I think the House of Commons Select Committee that reported on this last year came to the same conclusion. What you mentioned, one of the things that's most lacking at the moment, and that is evidence. The research is needed to be done, because we've had all this time where there have been different ways of teaching children with special needs, both in the maintained and in the private sector. And there ought to be a lot of evidence of what works best that hasn't really been brought together at all, I think. And so therefore I do believe it's time to have another report. And really and this time the report would do what our report didn't, which is look at the financial implications if we're really going to get it right.
Thank you for that. I wanted to just look at some more curriculum areas which you've expressed interest in, and your own background would show that. Both science and languages, both subjects that I suppose as a nation we worry about a lot at the moment. Let's look at science to begin with. I was looking at some figures, and we know them, our best universities lead the world in terms of science research. But if you look at the breadth of how we do in science, it's not there, is it? What are the causes of that we can produce some very good sciences, but as a nation, we don't choose to study science, and we've not got that experience in breadth?
I think it's a very, very interesting problem. I think there is something wrong with the way science is taught in secondary school. I think children in primary schools are often very much enthused with the sort of science they do. But in secondary schools, they find it very boring on the whole, except for the people who probably knew that they wanted to be scientists from the beginning, and it sort of doesn't matter to them how they're taught. They're going to mop it up anyway, because I don't think any teaching in the world would have made me into a proper scientist. But I would have loved to know more about the universe in general than I actually do. But somehow we've got to find a way of getting people enthusiastic enough and well informed enough to go on to university and pursue science at a higher level.
And I suppose the same is true of modern foreign languages, is that we've not got enough children doing well at school in modern foreign languages and going to university and going back into schools to teach. So looking at that, I know that's something which you are worried about.
Well, both. I mean, both science and languages. It's becoming terrifying because if people don't, as you said, go to university and study it, they can't come back and teach it. But if they do and are enthusiastic, then there's no end to what they can do. We should examine foreign languages by having what Ron Daring in his recent report described as a ladder system, where right from primary school you can make your own way up the ladder, taking exams when you're ready to take them, like the Associated Board music exams.
That's right, which is an excellent exam system.
That's right. And I think that would have enormous advantages because children would get ambitious as they do about music. I mean, it may not be the most elevated motive for pursuing a foreign language, but it would be very nice to say that you could get to a grade 5 sooner than whoever else is in the class. And the other advantage would be that the classes would have to be taught, or the classes would have to be of a mixed age group, because, I mean, a bilingual child would be shooting up to grade 8,
right,
and he'd be sitting beside somebody of 18. Now, this, I think, would have a huge effect on children's learning. And they wouldn't find it half as boring as they do now, language learning, if they were sitting with grown-ups who would ask different questions and before whom they could show off, so to speak.
I suppose that's a bit of a model that you could use for other curriculum areas as well, to tell you the truth.
I think so. I think so.
We are obsessed with age-related study, aren't we?
And I think school teachers are very, very, very hidebound in this way. Because I remember, when I was a headmistress, having the greatest difficulty in saying, well, it's stupid to teach all these children separately their grade 5 theory of music, which they all had to do if they were going on. Why don't we have a mixed-age class?
Some of the reports you've done for us as a nation on things like environmental protection and embryology have been, I suppose, about science, but also about moral issues, about how we make decisions in the light of technological advances. That's where life's different now than it was when we were at school.
Yes.
The generation of children coming through school now have got some pretty tough ethical decisions to take in the future. How do you think we prepare children for that? I listened to a suggestion only a few weeks ago which was talking about teaching 5- and 6-year-olds philosophy. I think they call it thinking skills, but it is essentially philosophy. I mean, you're a philosopher yourself. That was the start of your teaching. And you've looked at these ethical issues on behalf of us all. Is that where schools should be looking now?
Up to a point, I think that's true. I think it's more important as far as ethical issues go, that children should get an idea that there are some things that are morally right and some things that are morally unacceptable in terms of global issues. But it's terribly difficult to teach people to behave properly to other people. So my view is that first, teachers have got to be prepared themselves to distinguish morally bad things from morally good things.
Well, that's been a very wide-ranging discussion. I think probably we can conclude that schools remain as important as they ever have done, but I suppose the challenges that they face, both in terms of SEN, the breadth of the curriculum, motivating all children, is perhaps greater than it's ever been. From your standpoint, with all the experience you've had and your depth of knowledge, are you an optimist about the ability of the British education system to deliver for the children in the way that we need it to?
I think I am temperamentally an optimist. I think the one thing I'd like to be able to do, and I know I can't, would be to inspire more people to realise what a marvellous profession the teaching profession is, so that more of them would go into it, and more intelligent people, more imaginative people. And then I think our system could be wonderful, actually.
Baroness Warnock, thank you very, very much for joining us today.